Hello and welcome to Jericho TV. This is our inaugural episode, and this week I'm with Stuart Bolas, our African content editor, who is here to talk about the recent developments in Zimbabwe. This week Robert Mugabe has been replaced by Emerson Mnangagwa, who has been sworn in today. Stuart, would you mind running through exactly what's gone on over a rather tumultuous final 2 weeks of the Mugabe era?
Essentially what's happened is the then Vice President Emerson Mnangagwa, he was fired by Mugabe under the instruction of his wife, Grace Mugabe, because she would like to be the Vice President and then in turn the President. Emerson Mnangagwa fled the country and obviously contacted the army, and they basically enacted a coup d'etat in Zimbabwe, placing Robert Mugabe essentially under house arrest, and asked the public to take part and protest on the streets to show that they support what's been going on. And the ZANU-PF political party, which is Robert Mugabe's party, has essentially turned on him and was about to implement impeachment proceedings, upon which point he resigned. And Emerson Mnangagwa has now gone back to the country and he will be sworn in later today.
And why do you think this has happened now?
It's happened because there's a lot of fear of Robert Mugabe's wife, Grace Mugabe, taking power. He is 93 years old, so he's not going to be around forever. And his wife, because she'd removed Emerson Mnangagwa, there's supposed to be a party conference in December, and she was going to get sworn in as the Vice President. Now, that wasn't official, but it was basically obvious that was going to happen. And as she's very unpopular, I think many people thought that she would be the end of ZANU-PF and perhaps the complete and utter destruction of Zimbabwe, as much as it is. And they basically used this time frame to get rid of her as quickly as possible, and that's what they've done.
So, for those who don't know about the character of Grace Mugabe, why exactly is she so reviled in the country?
She married Mugabe in the mid-90s, so he'd already been president for quite a while at this point. They had been having an affair for quite some time because Mugabe's first wife was dying from terminal cancer. And his first wife was very popular, so the fact that he was with someone else during this point wasn't a good look. They had children during this time, and they had a massive marriage ceremony and everything like that. But in the last few years, she's become increasingly strident that she wants to be president. Now, she's a woman who's known for her shopping trips in Europe and in Asia. Allegedly she spent up to £1 million in Harrods in one day, buying various jewellery and designer clothes. That she attacked someone in South Africa and was able to get out of the situation by claiming diplomatic immunity. If she wants your land, she can just get it because the police won't stop her. No lawyer will touch your case, no judge will rule against her. She essentially was like a Marie Antoinette figure, but she didn't understand the problems many Zimbabweans are going through. Was using her power to do whatever she wanted. And in a country where most people don't have jobs, there's lots of poverty, she was just universally disliked.
Okay, so she is the Marie Antoinette figure, then the citizen Robespierre of the situation is clearly Emerson Mnangagwa, the so-called crocodile. Could you give us some background as to his story?
Well, I'll explain his nickname, the crocodile, essentially because he's a man who he doesn't speak very much, he just waits, and when he makes a move, he makes it quickly like a crocodile does. And once he bites, that's all he needs, and that's essentially what he did with this coup d'etat. He has known Mugabe for a very long time. Mugabe essentially recruited him when he was a teenager into the movement to fight for independence, because Mugabe used to be his teacher, because Mugabe used to be a teacher before he got into politics. And he was arrested and he was beaten and nearly executed by the then white minority government. So he did suffer in this sense, but he's been a loyalist in ZANU-PF and he's been linked to many of the atrocities and just mismanagement of Zimbabwe as well, because he's been a close confidant all this time. And then he became the vice president, which showed that he was someone who Mugabe trusted a lot. But he's very much a creature of ZANU-PF, and a lot of people do wonder if the country is going to change under him, because he has basically profited from the situation up to this point.
So you've touched upon change in the country. What do you think will happen next? He's been sworn in later today. There are elections in summer next summer.
Yeah. It's hard to say because there are many ways it could go. Number one, he could just be a man who is essentially exactly the same. Nothing changes. and there's still political repression, there's still no jobs, there's no opportunity for anyone, and this whole thing is just been a situation for them to remove Mugabe but just leave everything as it is. That would be awful. He could actually turn out to be a reformer who basically says, if I'm going to stay in power, I need to improve things, otherwise perhaps someone else will remove me as well. And then there is talk that he's a man who understands a bit more that the economy is not doing well, and that in his speech he made when he came back a few days ago, he said this country needs jobs, jobs, jobs. So he does sort of understand that they do need to fix things. So he could be a reformer who slowly moves Zimbabwe into the path of being the country it should have been many years ago. Or there is the opportunity that when they have the elections next year, he might even lose the elections, and maybe lose it to Morgan Tsvangirai, who is the leader of the long-suffering opposition movement, the MTC. But as I spoke with the other African editor, George Brillo, recently, it's unlikely that the MTC would win the next election, because the deep state and the elite in Zimbabwe are basically all ZANU-PF people, and they're not probably going to allow the opposition to win, be it vote rigging, intimidation, or whatever. So probably Emerson Mnangagwa's going to be there for a while, at least. I mean, from what I can see now, yeah, he'll probably be there for at least, I would say, at least one. He'll probably serve at least one term.
Okay, and obviously the fall of Mugabe has been widely reported in the international media, including Jericho, but it's been differently reported. I've noticed that you've talked about how the difference between say the BBC has reported it and other media organisations. Would you mind expanding on that?
Yeah, when I was getting information about what's happening in Zimbabwe, Al Jazeera was probably the best news media organisation to use, because they had someone they had a Zimbabwean reporter based in Zimbabwe, Harry Mutasa, which was really good. And she was always on the ground talking to people. She's lived there, she understands the situation. And they also had someone in South Africa who was basically relaying, how does South Africa feel about this? What's the South African community's feelings about this? You had the Southern African understanding of what was going on. The BBC, well, they do have someone in South Africa. They sent in people. They sent their reporters in London to go to Zimbabwe. They didn't recruit, it seems, any Zimbabweans until it's only much later you actually saw maybe Zimbabwean reporters saying things. So it felt as if you got a Western perspective of what was going on, but you weren't really getting a Zimbabwean perspective. And also back in the studios, instead of inviting, or just even calling up the South African Bureau and saying, can you get some professors from Cape Town University, or Stellenbosch, is not a famous university there, see what do they say about it. So you're going to get political scientists in these universities. They were instead just going around London and picking people up, which I imagine for them it's just a lot easier, and we do have some very good professors who know about Southern African politics, but for me it felt very lazy, that they have the resources to get really important Southern African voices, yet they just kind of couldn't be bothered. And it was only towards the end of the crisis in Zimbabwe that they really started asking Southern African opinion, rather they were just getting Western opinion about what's going on and reinforcing that with more Western opinion.
And what do you think that says about Britain's relationship with Zimbabwe or Africa as a whole? I
mean, so especially there was a lot of people who used to live in Zimbabwe when it was under white minority rule, giving their opinion. And I think I was saying to you earlier, Nick Soames, who was a Conservative MP, his father used to be the Governor General in Rhodesia when the British were still controlling it. And I was asking him about his opinion. Now, he had met Mugabe quite recently, so I guess it's something being asked, but I was saying to you, if there was a situation in Nigeria, you wouldn't ask the descendants of Britain's last Governor General there about what was going on in Nigeria, because it doesn't matter. Britain has not been there for decades. Why are you asking these people, in the sense that there are so many other people with better opinions you can ask, and the fact that an organisation as big and respected as BBC was just saying, or did anyone used to live there 25 years ago who would like to give an opinion? I mean, to me it just seemed lazy. And there is the idea that to relate the the crisis to British people, they had to find British faces to be able to make it relatable, which Al Jazeera, for example, doesn't do that. They just kind of use African faces to explain an African situation. It does show the BBC it does have to pander to its British audience quite a lot, and the idea that it's a world media organisation, I think you could call it into question somewhat.
Okay, you talked there about it being an African situation. How would you say this affects the wider African community? Robert Mugabe being one of the greatest presidents, great in terms of...
Well, he's probably the most famous
influence.
African president alive.
Yeah.
Again, ex-president now. But if you were to ask anyone in the street, name me an African president, Robert Mugabe is probably going to be definitely like the top three, or top two. He is someone who's been around for so long. He's survived so many situations, and he's just able to come out on top all the time, apart from this time. And you got to understand, for a lot of Africans, he was the guy who fought against the colonizer. There's no presidents who can really say that anymore. So he has that sort of, the first presidents of countries generally are sort of like a legend, like a myth, like you can't really touch them. And he was that to a lot of people. And there's many. I have some Ghanaian friends who refuse to really condemn him really because they say what he's done. Because I was trying to think of the way which would make it understandable for British people. If, for example, I'm not going to. You've got to understand the comparison I'm going to make is not a complete comparison. But if Winston Churchill after World War II had then started rigging elections and staying in power, and then was removed in his 90s, let's say 1960s, there would still be people in Britain who'd be like, yes, but he won World War II, so you can't really criticise him despite what he's done. And because Mugabe won the Bush War of Independence, that is still how some people see him. And despite everything he's done, and they'll admit, oh yeah, he made some mistakes, but he won independence. And so for many of them, it's something they find really difficult to criticise. But as I want to say, there will be some presidents in Africa who are facing movements in their own countries who will look at this and say, this is a guy we thought would never leave, and he's gone. Maybe my rule is not as strong as it was, and there'll be some protesters who will look at that and say, see, they did it in Zimbabwe, we can do it too. However, the difference is the army was firmly on the protesters' side, while in other countries, if the army is still on the side of the president, it's more likely that the protesters are not going to be successful.
Okay, so for example, we have protest movements now in Togo, in Cameroon. The army isn't on their side.
No.
Do you think that it could galvanise these movements at all?
It would definitely make them feel that anything is possible. If you can topple Mugabe, you can topple anyone. But again, like in Togo, the army is pretty much on the president's side. And I think about 15 people have died so far. So you've got to remember, in this Zimbabwean crisis, no one has died. It's been bloodless, which is actually something to be commended. In Cameroon, I'm not sure if anyone's died there, but it's been a situation where that's the English-speaking region, because it's a mostly French francophone country. English-speaking region feel discriminated against. They can't get government jobs because they can't speak French very well, etc., etc. And for them it's tough because they are a minority in their country fighting, so I think for them it's quite difficult. In Togo it's more of a, there's many places inside the country which are asking for the dynasty who runs Togo to resign, or just to step down, or just to only serve out his term and leave. But as I said, because the army in Cameroon and Togo are still very much back in their precedence, the only way they're going to make any headway is sadly with a lot more bloodshed. So it's up to them to decide if that's the way they want to go down.
So this year as well in Africa, we've seen, if not dynastic change in Angola, then at least a president who'd been there for 38 years stepping down. We've also got two live elections at the moment, one in Kenya, one in Liberia. How does this play into the regional situation?
I'll say there's definitely a sense of change sort of sweeping through the African continent, where big men who've just been in power for decades are either having to step down because they're just old, or in the case of Zimbabwe, eventually there's the movement against them just gets to the point they have to step down. In Angola, that president stepped down because he was ill. He'd been there for 38 years. But his successor, who took over, he actually fired the old president's daughters from various positions they had. So he may not be the successor he thought he was. There's an idea that perhaps he may be a liberalising force, but we don't know yet. As for Kenya and Liberia, in Kenya, yes, they've had a contested election. but the incumbent Uhuru Kenyatta was won. But he basically won an election where his opponent didn't really stand. So that's a situation where they may look at Zimbabwe and be like, perhaps we should go to the streets and protest. But as anyone's guess. As for Liberia, the second round still has to happen. And no one's really protesting because they still have an election to go. The fact that they are having a free and fair election, if you know the history of Liberia, is a very momentous thing. And even though they are not a prosperous nation yet, they are a stable nation. Which, so you can commend the rule of Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, who's also one of the only female leaders in Africa, who's actually just served her 2 terms and gone, which is a great thing. But I think probably George Weah, the famous footballer from AC Milan, will probably win because he just has the star power. But whether he'll be give the new dynamism to Liberia or just be another incumbent who doesn't really change much, we just have to wait and see.
Okay, so it seems that unless you've got the military behind you or you're a superstar footballer, then little is going to change in your country.
Exactly.
Well, that's all from the Jericho podcast. Thank you very much for watching.